Welcome to the Azure podcast. This is episode 479, being recorded on the 15th of November 2023. I'm Russell Young, and I'm joined today by Kale, Sujit, and Cynthia. Welcome back, Cynthia, and our special guest today as well. So another fellow peer of mine from Microsoft UK subsidiary, a chap called Keith Howling, and Keith is a cloud solution architect, focuses on app development, and he's been doing a lot of work and enablement around Radius recently, and quite passionate about that. And it's a topic that a lot of us that do or did app development quite keen to find out a lot more about. It's sparked quite a lot of interest. Before we go over to Keith and get his proper intro, because I'm sure he'll correct me on the job title as well. I think Cloud Solution Architect might be his previous role, actually. Now I think about it, but we'll get all that information later. So I'll hand over first of all to Kale. I think you've got a few updates recently.
Yeah, sure. So just three here today from me. The first one, there's a couple here, just like kind of announcements, and then one other special one from our blog. So the first one here is around the rate limits for the application gateway web app firewall. So basically, the rate limit custom rules for these kind of things are now available on the app gateway. So the rate limiting allows you to do certain things based on your traffic, as far as like detecting abnormal like levels and things like that you want to tweak. So you can use those pieces on there. That's GA now specifically. So this is something that's been in preview and now coming out of GA. So the rate limiting rules for the firewall. The other one that's similar to that is around TLS support. And this was a call out. I think we talked about this in some past podcasts around TLS, but support for TLS 1 and 1.1, which are considered kind of deprecated now, will end actually next year on Halloween, so October 31st. 2024 is when those things are. So again, just a call out to make sure that you're using at least the 1.2 or later TLS for your Azure services that you're using up there. And the last one is around something similar that I've talked about before, around like cost analytics and kind of usage and cost analytics that you have on your tenant. So there's this thing called FinOps, and there's actually a spec around this called Focus, which is the FinOps Open Cost and Usage spec. Pretty funny, but basically it's a really cool format for basically organizing and collecting all the data that lets organizations better understand their usage patterns, where they're spending in the cloud, those kind of things. So there's a preview of this, which includes like some cool dashboards and roll-ups and things like that have been created. Super helpful for enterprises who are trying to get a handle on their cloud spend and where they're spending money. We talk about this quite a lot around the different kind of providers that we have in there to help you better manage your spend in Azure. But this is another way to do it. So we'll put a link in the show notes for that as well.
Yeah, I spotted that Focus announcement the other day and sent it through to one of my customers. I think particularly for organizations a little bit smaller that don't have their own FinOps teams and haven't really given a lot of thought to this stuff, I think it's a great place to start. Really puts a lot of good resources in front of you. Thanks, Kale. Sujit?
Hey, thanks, Russell. Yes, I've got a few today, two of them specifically on the Azure Chaos Studio. So Chaos Studio allows you to introduce chaos in your applications, and there's a way where you can create a template for your various experiments that you are working on. And there's two new experiments templates that they've added to Azure Chaos Studio. One of them is the Azure Active Directory outage template. So by applying that to your VM, you can simulate as if like, hey, there's an AAD outage. How is your VM going to react? And the second one is, and it does that, by the way, by kind of modifying some of the NSG rules in your network so that the requests to the AAD endpoint are going to fail. And the second one is the availability zone down template. This is, again, is very important. I know I'm working on something similar with some customers at this moment where they want to be able to detect when a particular availability zone goes down so that they can take action and failover and whatnot. And again, this is another template that's available in Chaos Studio now. Also in Chaos Studio, so when you kind of run the when you want to introduce chaos, there's no better way to do it than to introduce load in your system, right? So you want to introduce some sort of load, so then you can see how your system's going to react to that load, high CPU, high memory, or whatever it may be the case. So now you can actually take the output from your Azure load testing service, right, and apply it to the Azure Chaos Studio, right? So you've already got load profile set up with Azure load testing. You can take that and simply attach it to your Chaos Studio designer, and it will then make sure that that load is applied to the system while you start introducing chaos in it. And so this is nice combination of two services that we have in Azure. And thirdly, like more for developers here, Azure Functions now supports the .NET 8 in the isolated worker model. So if you're kind of up on the latest and greatest .NET versions, which I think are going to be released today. I think today is the start of Ignite. We should have mentioned that earlier. But yeah, they're already available now in the .NET Functions framework choices. And then a couple more here. This one's really cool, actually, and I didn't know about this, but when you use an app service, by default you get like a front end service, a front end endpoint, and that front end endpoints talk to your workers in the back end, right? And so if you use TLS, the TLS terminates on the front end, but from the front end to the back end, it's non-TLS. Now, if you use the old, not the old, but the on-premises or the lockdown ASC version of app service, you did have that option of doing the encryption all the way through to the workers. It wasn't available in the multi-tenanted version. Happy to say that they have released it for the multi-tenanted version now. So in the multi-tenanted version of app service, you can have the SSL termination all the way to the workers and not have that gap in your security posture. And then finally, Azure Monitor Logs. A lot of regulations require logs to be preserved for some period of years. Typically, it's been 7 years, and that's the amount that they would allow you to preserve in Azure Monitor Logs. But now in some locations, because of healthcare and tax reasons, they needed 10 to 12 years. And so now they bumped it up to 12 years. So you have an option of keeping your logs for up to 12 years. And that's it for me, Russell. Thank you.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. Yeah, and apologies, Keith. I know you're a principal technical specialist now, I believe.
Yeah, you've been reading Active Directory, haven't you?
I have.
That's right. That's my title. Yeah. No worries.
So, do you want to give us a quick overview about your, what you do in Microsoft and why you wanted to go on and talk about Radius and what that's all about?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's first time on the podcast, so thanks for the invite. So yes, I'm an Azure technical specialist. So I work quite closely with Russell and his team, focused on digital and application innovation. So that essentially means helping customers move, either upgrade and modernize existing application estates into the cloud, or develop net new architectures. And make sure those architectures are cloud native, using all the best Azure services to meet the customer needs, often around a well-architected framework with all its tenets of reliability, security, cost optimization, etc. So I've been doing this in a couple of roles for about 7 years now. So had quite a bit of experience within Microsoft in mapping out these application journeys over to our Azure PaaS services. So in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, that's often meant a journey to AKS, our Kubernetes service. AKS has grown just enormously over that time. Its popularity has really grown, and there's so many organizations out there that have adopted Kubernetes on Azure in AKS and other clouds, and it's really become a proven scalable platform for application deployment. We see a lot of organizations really like the agnostic nature of Kubernetes, in that there's no one vendor that controls the roadmap or specification. It's a CNCF project. And so that it gives you a sense of application portability and being able to implement the same APIs across different clouds. The hyperscalers have got it very well integrated into their stacks. So in Azure, for example, we have an excellent product group who's been iterating nonstop, it feels like, for the last 5 or 6 years, and integrating Kubernetes experience deeply within our fabric of our cloud to drive that. And it's proven in mission critical scale as well. With Black Friday coming up, we've got a lot of retailers that are relying on these services. So hence the interesting radius, really. So one of the challenges of that AKS, of implementing AKS is when a workload team look to move their workloads onto a platform like Kubernetes, it can be quite a complicated activity. So the workload teams are left with having to understand how to define an application in Kubernetes terms, and that often means pods, deployments, ingresses, all of those Kubernetes API primitives. But that really doesn't give you the definition of that application. Applications are not just a container or a set of containers. Applications have dependencies, they have key vaults, they have caches, they have databases, they have messaging queues. And so there's oftentimes there's a lot of technology there for workload teams to understand about how do we define our application, how do we deploy it, to make sure we've got all the right tooling in place, and that can be a complicated task. The other piece around Kubernetes is that again, AKS takes a lot of the automation and provides you a lot of options for Microsoft managed capabilities for its add-ons portfolio, but still there's quite a bit of best practice that gets baked in to understand how to operate fleets of clusters at scale and how to ensure they continue to get updated and ensure they continue to host those mission critical workloads. And as such, we've seen a lot of organizations build platform engineering teams around that activity to ensure that all those good practices are kept. So where does Radius fit? The main challenges here is there's no clear definition of an application in that ecosystem, so for the workload teams, and there's not a clear separation between what the platform team activities are and what the workload team activities are. And Radius comes and really fills that gap and gives you a rock solid, concrete separation of the platform team concern and the workload team concern, and where those boundaries are. It's very opinionated in that capability. So the platform team is responsible for creating things like recipes, which we'll get into for the operations side, and the application team is responsible for creating the application definition. Okay, go ahead, Sujit.
Keith,
sorry, I wasn't sure who.
Through platform and workload, it kind of reminds me of the whole DevOps evolution probably a decade ago. How does CI/CD fit into all of these, and do people then replace some of the existing tools they currently use to use Radius, or is it complementary that they use Radius and they use GitHub Actions or they use whatever other CI/CD tool?
Yeah, great question. So Radius is actually built on top of your infrastructure as code templating language. So it actually leverages that side of the operations team. So it's built on an extensible model around Bicep or Terraform. So you will continue to use your Terraform or Bicep modules and publish those modules out as maybe platform teams are already doing. But because of the extensibility, it also gives the application workload teams the ability to define their application in those languages as well, in Bicep or Terraform, where the two marry up. So it's not necessarily replacing or any existing tool sets. You would still use your GitHub Actions or your pipelines to run those to run the automation around that. But ultimately, to do local development and production deployment, there's a CLI tool that Radius comes with that the workload or pipeline would call that would do that deployment for you. And also that CLI will leverage the bicep definitions of your services and applications to provision those in your preferred cloud provider. So it's kind of filling the gap. It's not necessarily replacing any tool sets. It's kind of filling the gap where in the past, folk have had to really create scripts or bundle stuff together or do something very proprietary to their own environment. This Radius is trying to bring a real concrete viewpoint on how we think you should operate across those things.
And Keith, when I first read about Radius a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that confused me, it was pitched as like being an application platform of some sort. And when I look at the details, it's more of an infrastructure deployment system or platform. I mean, there aren't any, the applications don't have to change the way that they work, right? There aren't any APIs as such that are on Radius. It's, applications, if you're writing a Spring Boot app or .NET service or something like that, that would still remain the same. You have your application APIs and all that. It's just, what I'm understanding is that it's the way that you put it all together so that you can deploy it into AKS or any other Kubernetes environment is what is provided for you. I'm wondering if you could just clarify that for us.
And that's exactly right. So no, that's a good point. So the real value here comes when, as I say, when you're defining your application as a workload team, Radius provides you with a set of application definition resources. Just like if you're familiar with Bicep or Terraform, just like you'd have a resource for a database or a network or a VM, what Radius brings is a definition of an application. So now you're defining your app as a Bicep or Terraform resource, and Radius itself gives you a control plane that will understand that definition of that application, and that application may have a link to a database, to a message queue, to a cache. And then it understands how to deploy it and how to provision it, not just on Azure, but on AWS and other clouds as well. So it's again that vendor agnostic nature of Radius. What's made Kubernetes so popular? It allows you to give you that application definition and all of the dependencies in a graph that you can provide, and then Radius knows how to deploy it to those different clouds, rather than those teams having to do other things. So yeah, it's very much it's not its own discrete service. It very much needs Kubernetes. So if you don't have a Kubernetes cluster, you can't install or use Radius. So it's very much tied to Kubernetes at the moment. But if you think of it as, I like the analogy when you look at Azure and how our portal works. We have resource providers for databases, for virtual machines, for Azure functions. But what we don't have a resource for is an application. We don't have an application-centric view, whereas Radius brings an application-centric view, and it knows how to provision it. If you point to your AWS environment or Azure environment, it knows how to then build that and run it out. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, Keith, one question I had was that maybe our listeners have as well is, I think it's not a new concept to say, hey, we can build a layer above these clouds and be able to perform these operations above them. I think, years back we had things from like Cloud Foundry. I think most popular now is like Porter and things like that. So I guess the question is what's Radius doing differently? If you can comment on that, what's it bringing to the table that some of these other platforms we had before that sit on top there do?
So I think that's a great question. I think the differentiator here is, so Microsoft have built up a lot of experience about how to define resources in the cloud and how that scales. And it's been, obviously we have a long history in folk using infrastructure as code to deploy applications and services up to the cloud. We've taken a lot of learning from that, the team that developed Radius, and we've implemented the pattern in a very similar way, in that we've now got a new set of definitions that actually define our application, not the underlying infrastructure resources. But I think the key differences are a couple of things. One is we're not introducing a new language here. We're not introducing anything new that folk have to learn. We're just introducing a new resource types in either Bicep or Terraform that give you that ability to create that application definition in those infrastructure as code languages that you're already using today. Also, the other really big piece of this is how we separate the dev and the ops side. So as an application developer, you deploy your application into an environment, and you specify your application, the containers it contains, maybe the cache you want, the databases you need, but you're not authoring the underlying Bicep or Terraform that will create those cloud resources. That's what the operations team will do. So when the platform team build an environment for you for the workload teams, they'll have already created these modules that we call recipes to know how do I deploy a SQL resource, or how do I deploy a Redis cache or MongoDB in our preferred in this environment. And that may be that they will have enabled federated workload identity. They may have enabled Key Vault for containers for any key credentials. And because all you have to do as a workload team then is link to that pre-definition of that resource that the platform team have done. So when you're defining your app and you say I want a SQL database, you just say my environment is the test environment for this particular group. There'll be a recipe that your platform team will have done that will provision either AWS or Azure resources in line with those security standards. But the app team don't need to know how to do that, how to work out private endpoints or federated identity or anything like that. But the important credentials to link your application up will be injected into your application code dynamically. So that kind of boundary between the workload team's responsibility and the platform team's responsibility is very well defined. And I don't think we've really had that definition, that separation before. We have seen our customers do it all the time, but we've never really had any prescribed tooling around that boundary before.
You've just connected the dots that, sorry, Carl, you just connected the dots that I was going to ask a question around, because I was trying to get my head around when you talk about, you define what the application looks like, and yet you use words like it connects to a database and you've got dependencies and you need to describe those. I'm then thinking, well, you need to provision a SQL database somewhere. How do you do that? I now understand that you don't need to do that as an app developer. I can start with a blank canvas and I can say, I've got a web app here. I need a SQL server. I need a Redis cache, or I need a caching mechanism. And the rest of it's connected by the recipes, which is basically a link to a predefined library of stuff that your ops team have got that has the infrastructure as code to deploy those things and hook them together somehow.
Yeah, and what's really nice is if you can use your local machine or a dev cluster as a development environment, and the recipes in the development environment will be super lightweight. They may be just a Redis container that will run directly in your cluster if you ask for a Redis cache. And so when you deploy your application definition on your local host to do your local loop, that will be super quick to deploy, very cost efficient, just using in-cluster open source Redis cache. But then when you deploy that same application definition into your production server, the recipe in the production server for a Redis cache will be a Bicep recipe that your ops team have generated with private link, federated identity, the right tier of service. It may be even regional failover. All of that kind of platform enablement will be abstracted for you, but your application definition doesn't change as you go across your environment.
And all the monitoring that goes with it, all that kind of good stuff that goes into making it a production service. Right, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Sorry, Carl, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no worries. I just had a follow-up there on this. So when this thing, you've been talking a lot about how this helps at the application level deploy all these dependent resources and things like that underneath. Should we think about Radius like a platform then to also like manage that? Or is it like once it deploys it, then ops teams can like jump right into Azure, let's say they're using Azure, and start messing with those things if they need to? Or is it like, no, the way this works, we always go through Radius, and then Radius is kind of our plane, control plane, as you said earlier. We just continue to use that going forward, or how's that work?
So great question again. So I think if you think of if let's say we're going to define a production environment in Radius. So an environment in Radius is a top level resource definition that has a list of recipes, and a recipe is ultimately a module in an OCR compliant store. So it could be a bicep module or a Terraform module. So if the platform team iterate on their modules and they have updates that they want to have configuration updates or changes to their recipes, they can version and update those recipes. So that's built into the platform. And also obviously the workload team, if they want to iterate, they can iterate their application definitions and whatnot as they go forward. So the idea would be that the recipes and the applications would just up version over time and improve over time as it moves forward. But Radius would always be your point of running and deploying the application through the Radius CLI through those definitions. Now, of course, go into the portal, have a look at the resources, do what you need to do in there in terms of going in and having a look at log analytics and various things. That's still open to you. But yeah, you'd want to keep Radius as your source of truth for deploying. So, great question.
Just to kind of go on to the next step then, is Radius just an engine that gets used at deployment time, or is there more to it that does stuff elsewhere? Is it just something that you call that does the orchestration of that deployment?
Yeah. So really interesting. So Radius comes in 2 bits. You've got, they call it a universal control plane. So the universal control plane, when you first of all, you download a CLI tool called RAD. Of course, every good solution has to have a CLI tool. And then when you do a RAD init, which is one of the first steps you do to get this thing running, it installs the universal control plane. Think of it like the Azure Resource Manager. Think of it like a small version of the Azure Resource Manager, but it installs that into your Kubernetes cluster. So then your RAD CLI is interacting with the Azure Kubernetes in the universal control plane, which is a set of pods running in your Kubernetes cluster, and those are responsible for then looking at your instruction. It holds all of these resources definitions. So it's got its recipes, environments, workspaces, application definitions, links. All of those things are held in the cluster as resource definitions. And so you're instructing those pods in the control plane to go ahead then and run this bit of bicep on Azure or run this bit of Terraform on AWS, and then deploy your app definition into the Kubernetes cluster. So that's the job of that universal control plane that's doing all that work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I know, Kale, you may want to go next, but I wanted to ask, just on that means there isn't some sort of a daemon set or something that's deployed, which is constantly, I don't know, doing stuff with these deployments, right? Like as Russell was saying, once you issue the CLI command or you do the bicep command or whatever, it's just going to do the deployment. Essentially, under the covers, it would be translating it to normal bicep ARM commands or templates and deploying it to Azure. And once it's done, it's offhand. It's like offhands, right? In terms of that, until you give the next command. In between commands, there is no Radius involvement. I would say.
I don't believe. I haven't seen any kind of desired state type of operations there. I don't believe so. I wouldn't not 100% sure on that, but I think it's very much a CLI initiated set of activities. Yeah, it's a good question. I'll take a look, but I don't believe so. That would be cool though, if it was desired state.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing too that goes along with this discussion, we talk about a lot of things inside Microsoft around like unified cloud, which is things even beyond Azure, but use Azure, things like the Power Platform or Teams or any of these kind of things. I guess the question I have is like something like Radius, how extensible is that? Is it like, no, this thing's kind of really locked to like these cloud vendors and like resource providers in our case, or is it like no, you can actually plug other things into your automation to do other things out there, maybe even GitHub or something,
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So you can imagine taking a dependency on Radius is a pretty significant decision by any team. It's going to change the way that you define your applications, and it's going to specify a working pattern between your platform teams. So it's whenever we release these types of open source projects like Dapper or Radius, we do it because we see a lot of our customers are struggling with these areas, and we do it because we're trying to fill a hole where to stop having every individual organization creating an engineering team to build their own solutions. That's how Radius, that's how Dapper came about. So a lot of the extensibility we've learned from our Azure experience in having a portal, having resource manager, multiple resource managers, being able to provision hundreds of resources through that one area, having a whole marketplace full of solutions as well. That's also been brought to Radius. So those same tried and trusted design patterns are in there. So at the moment, you'll see when you look at environment definitions, for example, the only compute kind that the guys support right now is Kubernetes, but there is a compute kind field. So I imagine in the future, there may be other services in there, functions, logic apps, whatever else, but that definitely the pattern for that is extensible, similar to at the moment we support Terraform and Bicep, but and offloading those modules to the those various engines. But again, it's definitely extensible. Today there's good recipe coverage, I think, for AWS and Azure. GCP may follow in the future, but the extensibility is definitely built into there. And the fact that if customer teams do start taking this as the dependency and they see it as a problem, actually we need to solve this and we don't want to engineer our own solution. We've being multi-cloud and agnostic it always drives way more adoption than if it was tied into one vendor.
Yeah, and real quick follow on that is I think maybe you've mentioned it already. So is this entire project open source? And is it something like Microsoft kind of bootstrapped this, or is just like a strong member supporting this? We have other like cloud groups working on this or other companies, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, this has come from our labs team in Microsoft. So very similar to Dapper, Mark Rosanovich out of a CTO organization created this solution, and you see that because of those lessons learned from how Azure and the portal and that whole piece. When you start to use Radius, you'll see that a lot of lessons have been learned over the years, and that's been baked into the design pattern. So yeah, that's where that's come from. Any other questions?
Yeah, so two kind of comments I wanted to make. One is I was just looking up the documentation for Radius as you were talking earlier, Keith. And the interesting point was that it's all containers, right? Everything is a container. I think that's like the medium of deployment these days. So there's no option for running stuff in a VM and whatnot. Everything has to be bundled as a container. And the second thing, you kind of briefly mentioned Dapper, and glad to see that that's a first-class citizen in Radius, where they actually have a Dapper resource. And so, you could use if you're already using Dapper, great. If you're not using Dapper, you still have those application level platforms or frameworks available to you, right? We talked earlier how this is more of a deployment system, but with the Dapper extension, I can see how this is also opinionated in the way that you build applications, right? Now, obviously, you have to build a Dapper application. You're going to have to adopt all of the things that Dapper kind of requires you to do using their state stores and PubSub and whatever else they have to offer. So it's nice to see that's there, because that would certainly make it, as an application developer, would help me as well, right? I mean, we want to get into the cloud native world. Yes, we want to make sure our ops team is into cloud native worlds. We also want to make sure the application team is getting into the cloud native world, and I think that's where the Dapper is going to come in.
Yeah, 100%. I think like most things, Dapper again is an abstraction that it will significantly change the way that you go about building the actual fabric of your application itself. Think of inside the container, so Radius is for things outside the container. Dapper is for architecting your apps inside the container. And again, that is an abstraction choice that you can make as a workload team if you're looking to develop a microservice-based app, and Dapper brings a lot of value in that particular process, but it's not a prerequisite. It's not mandatory. It's something, again, you can make a choice on whether you want to include Dapper or not. But as you say, if you do include it, it's there as a first-class resource inside of Radius for deployment. So yeah, good point. Thanks.
What's the life cycle of the infrastructure that gets deployed as part of the recipe? Because it sounds like there's like the recipe, and then it goes to deploy the VM or the Redis cache or whatever you're deploying. So then after that, how do you manage to make sure that when I want to delete the cache, it's also deleted whatever else Radius is tracking it?
Right. Yeah.
All R's.
That's a great question. So if the recipe is ultimately a link to a module, a bicep or a Terraform module that tells Radius how to deploy that application to that dependency to whatever cloud. When you're creating your application definition, you're linking into that resource. You're specifying the resource, giving it a name, and then linking it to the application. As I said, if you delete, so you can go ahead and Radius, the CLI has it's very much structured like the kubectl CLI. So you give it your kubectl with the resource, and then get, list, set, or show. It's a very similar thing. So you can go ahead and delete that application, and that so it's a good question. I'm assuming that application then will get removed from the environment that you specify from the infrastructure. I'd have to see if there's a specific command to do that, or whether it will do it kind of just as a normal delete operation in the Radius CLI. So yeah, it's a good question. I have to have a look to see if it actually will delete all the resources. Wouldn't like to make an assumption there. I guess it would make sense if it does. So just to tidy up all of its deployment resources. So yeah, but yeah, because ultimately the definition of the application is in bicep, and you would absolutely just check that bicep into your repo as part of that application. So the source of truth is still the repo, and then so that you can redeploy that app anytime you want into any environment.
It's been really interesting. I mean, it's like the clouds have cleared for me, and I suddenly get it when you explained it earlier. And I've started looking at some of the documentation now. It's all kind of fits into place, and I can see really why this is a great tool to use. Before we kind of wrap up, is there how would you suggest we kind of get our hands wet with it, or dip our feet in, or whatever the analogy is, to get going with it and get started and have a play?
Yeah, so you'll see the first point in the getting started guide. So the website is a great place to start. It's got a great getting started guide. So it's radapp.com. Radapp.io. So RADAPP. The challenge is the very first thing it will say as a prereq is you need a Kubernetes cluster, and that for some is not an insignificant piece of work to set that up. So obviously we have, if you have access to an Azure subscription, you can go ahead and provision a fairly standard AKS cluster, just accept all the defaults from the portal. And then the rad init command will do the rest. So then it will just show you that then the tutorial about how to deploy your first application, how to deploy your first recipe, and go through that process. So I know, Russell, I know you and I have worked recently on a couple of customers where actually we've seen folk build their own solutions in this space before. So I think what will be really interesting for anybody who's actually already built a solution, perhaps to abstract maybe a multi-cloud Kubernetes landscape, or if they're thinking about putting their own solution together, definitely give Radius a look, because as I say, it's got a lot of our best practices baked in. It scales, and if it saves you 6 months of writing your own engineering solution, then that's brilliant.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, on the AKS bit, I did find a demo in Microsoft Learn, and there's a quick start in there, and I think it took less than 5 minutes. I had a cluster up and running, so I think to get going with that's quite straightforward now as well. They've made the command line stuff so easy now. But no, thank you for that. That's been really interesting. If you've got any other kind of links and resources that you want to share with listeners, then if you can pass them on to me, and I'll share them in the show notes below. But if nobody else has got any other questions, I'd just like to say thank you very much. That's really, really comprehensive and good explanations. Thank you.
No, thanks for the invite, and thanks for the questions as well. Thanks for, yeah,
Thanks, Keith.
all good stuff.